Hello! In this presentation, we will be reviewing real estate withholding on installment sales. In today's presentation, we will review some definitions, withholding requirements, and certifications. We will also review withholding calculations on installment payments. We will discuss withholding during and after escrow. And lastly, we will cover how to elect out of withholding and to notify FTB of any changes. For withholding purposes, an installment sale is a sale of California real property where the seller receives at least one payment after the tax year of the sale. Remitter refers to any person who is required to remit to FTB any tax withheld on any disposition from the sale or exchange of California real estate and file the prescribed forms on the buyer's behalf. Buyer refers to the buyer or any other transferee of real property. Seller refers to the seller or any other transferor of real property. Withholding is required on the sale or transfer of California real property unless an exemption applies. When withholding is required, sellers are not being double taxed. The tax is withheld upfront like wage withholding from an employer. The withholding credit can be claimed on their California income tax return and potentially result in a refund or offset their tax liability. In an installment sale, the buyer is required to withhold on the principal portion of each installment payment, including the down payment during escrow, unless an exemption applies. Here we have the buyer's transferee acknowledgement to withhold. It can be found on side 2 of Form 593. To summarize, it is the agreement the buyer is making when entering in an installment sale. The buyer is agreeing to withhold on the principal portion of each installment payment, completing Form 593 and Payment Voucher 593V when a principal payment is made and submitted to the Franchise Tax Board, along with the withholding payment by the due date. The buyer is also agreeing to provide the seller with a copy of each Form 593 submitted if the terms of the installment sale, promissory note, or payment schedule change. The buyer will promptly inform FTB. Lastly, the seller acknowledges that they understand they may be subject to withholding penalties if they fail to withhold, send the withholding along with Form 593 to FTB by the due date, or they do not provide a copy of Form 593 to the seller transfer by the due date. This is the perjury statement section, which can be found on the bottom of side 3 of Form 593. This is where the buyer and seller make their certifications by checking off applicable boxes. For the first installment payment, the seller and buyer must both sign the bottom of side 3 of Form 593. If no exemptions applied in Part 3, the seller should check off the second box of the perjury statement on side 3, which indicates the sale is fully or partially exempt from withholding as indicated by a check mark in Part 4, Box 11. If the seller has elected the alternative withholding calculation be done, they must certify by checking the third box of the perjury statement. The buyer should check the fourth box of the perjury statement to acknowledge they understand and accept the withholding requirement we reviewed on the previous slide. The buyer and seller must both sign the first Form 593 submitted by escrow. Subsequent forms submitted to FTB do not require the seller's signature.
The total sales price withholding method is 3 1/3% of the installment payment amount. Withholding is only required on the principal portion of each payment. Another withholding option is the alternative withholding calculation method. Here is an example of how to calculate the alternative withholding amount. Multiply the installment payment by the installment sale withholding percentage, which is located on line 36 of Part 7 on the Form 593. Here we have a $2,000 installment payment and a 10% installment sale withholding percentage, which totals $200. Next, you take the applicable tax rate and multiply it by the total from our previous calculation. In this example, the seller is an individual, so we multiply $200 by 12.3%, which equals $24.60. $24.60 would be submitted as the withholding payment along with Form 593 and the payment voucher Form 593V. Remember, individuals and non-California partnerships calculate withholding using the current maximum tax rates. To find current tax rates, go to ftb.ca.gov/tax-rates. Escrow must withhold on the first payment made in an installment sale unless an exemption in Part 3 on Form 593 applies to the seller. Escrow must also submit the following to FTB: Form 593, the payment voucher Form 593V, the amount withheld, and a copy of the promissory note. The promissory note must include the principal amount, installment amount, interest rate, and the length of the repayment period. After escrow, the buyer is now the remitter and responsible for withholding going forward. The buyer must submit Form 593, Form 593V, and the amount withheld to FTB by the 20th day of the next month. Send the seller a copy of the Form 593 that was submitted to FTB. Keep a copy of Form 593 for their records. And write final installment payment on the bottom of Form 593 when the last installment payment is made. The seller can elect out of withholding on subsequent payments by doing the following: file a California income tax return and report the entire gain on Schedule D1 for the year of the sale, or call FTB or submit a written request to release the buyer from withholding. FTB will send a letter to the seller to let them know if their request is approved. The buyer must notify FTB if the installment sale or promissory note terms change or if the payment schedule changes. For more information on real estate withholding, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel or search real estate withholding on our website, ftb.ca.gov. If you have any questions regarding installment sales or other real estate withholding in general, please call us at 916-845-4900 or toll free at 888-792-4900. This concludes our presentation. We hope you have found this information helpful. Thank you.